If you just started on your Spanish journey, this is a wonderful time. And while you may feel overwhelmed at times and you may be facing some challenges, enjoy the newbie games. But if you've been learning Spanish for a while, then you know the dark secret that we all must come to know.
Rico, reconocer,
Si
reconocer.
ya viajas de jeans es porque sos un tipo que está...
No, pero solo lo menciono porque se me hace muy chistoso que...
Cosas que hacía en Cuba y en España ya no puedo
Como el
hacer.
güey que agarraron para poner su voz con la roca de fondo.
Now, it's no secret that any language, especially one that's widespread, is going to have different accents and dialects. But Spanish in particular has an incredibly rich variety of cultures, which makes it a super rewarding language to learn. However, as I can personally attest, as someone who's gotten to travel to a couple of Spanish-speaking countries, it can be pretty shocking and even a little discouraging when all of a sudden you're confronted with a new accent that makes you feel like you're back at square one. Oh, by the way, let me know if you'd like to hear any of these stories at some point, like the time I got robbed in Ecuador or the time I ended up in Honduras with no wallet. Those are separate occasions, by the way, separated by like a decade of time. Am I bad at traveling? Now, when it comes to defining the different varieties of Spanish, the most natural tendency for native speakers and for learners is to think of it by country. So you'll often hear terms like Cuban Spanish, Mexican Spanish, Ecuadorian Spanish, and so on. And when you look in dictionaries, regional vocabulary is often marked like this, further reinforcing the idea that Spanish can be neatly divided up along country borders. The problem with thinking about it like that is that most often a country will contain multiple varieties, and oftentimes those dialects may be more similar to those found in other countries or other regions than they are to the ones right next door.
Pero ¿cuál acento de Colombia? Porque sabes que en Colombia, como en todos los países del mundo, hay muchos acentos diferentes. Yo normalmente hago el de Medellín. También está el costeño, que es así como relajado.
But before we get into other ways of viewing it, let's take a look at the cases where it does make sense to look at things through the lens of a country-by-country analysis. One, when it comes to national vocabulary. A lot of times due to political events or cultural history of a particular country, there may be certain terms that are widespread throughout that country, but not common elsewhere. Two, if you're going to be traveling or living within one particular country, then obviously it makes more sense to focus in on the accents and dialects that exist within that country and understand them in relation to one another rather than viewing how they fit into the overall Spanish-speaking world. And three, some countries, whether it's due to their small size or just a particular quirk of how they develop, do have relatively stable accents throughout. And in that case, it may make more sense to think of there being a national accent or a national dialect. So, if we don't primarily focus on country divisions when it comes to languages, how else can we wrap our head around the variety of dialects we find in the Spanish-speaking world? Well, that's how this book revolutionized the way I think of Spanish. It goes into a number of ways that linguists have gone about trying to categorize or explain those varieties of Spanish based on different combinations of grammar, pronunciation, or vocabulary. But to me, the simplest and most helpful way of thinking of it is Lowland Spanish, Highland Spanish, and the other ones. That's right. I bet you didn't expect topography. So by Highland Spanish, we're referring to literally places in high elevation. So that would be most of Mexico and the mountainous areas of Central and South America. And by lowlands, we mean exactly the opposite. So basically anywhere you're close to water. So that would include the islands, as well as the coastal regions of Mexico, Central America, and South America. And the other ones are Argentina and Uruguay, who I think we can all agree are just like doing their own thing. Disclaimer, I recognize that within each of these categories, there are a lot of distinct varieties. And I'm sure the native speakers of these dialects can even share some of those differences and some of the things that make the way they speak unique. However, these categories are based on the most salient or the most obvious phonological features, which I think can be helpful for those who are learning. So what are some of the defining characteristics of each of these varieties? Well, as one linguist put it, las tierras altas se comen las vocales, las tierras bajas se comen las consonantes. Category 1. Lowland Spanish is known for a series of lenitions or weakenings that would include aspiration or deletion of the S sound when it's at the end of a syllable, weakening or deletion of a D when it's found between vowels, and the weakening of the R sound. You might see neutralization of R and L at the end of syllables, or even a reversal of those two sounds.
Si antes te hubiera conocido.
Category 2. Highland Spanish is a little bit harder to pin down since there is a wide variety of pronunciation of different consonant sounds.
Y las palabras que comienzan con R, rico, reconocer, recordar.
But one common feature is that they tend to preserve those consonant sounds as opposed to Lowland Spanish, but there is a tendency to drop vowel sounds, particularly when found near the S sound.
No, pero solo lo menciono porque se me hace muy chistoso que... Entonces, pues aquí estamos.
Category 3. The dialects of Uruguay and Argentina are pretty similar in some ways to Lowland Spanish in that they also feature lenition or weakening of certain consonant sounds, particularly that S sound we talked about. But they're known for two notable features that kind of set them apart. One is using the pronoun vos instead of tú, along with its accompanying verb forms, and also a special pronunciation of the double L and Y sound, which is known as either jeísimo, if it's pronounced as j, like in vision. So you might hear words like yo, ayuda, or you might have a devoiced version of that same sound, so the sh sound, which is classically associated with Buenos Aires, but has become popular throughout the region.
Mi novia me dijo que si llegamos a los 4 millones de seguidores, yo no creía llegar, chicos, no creía. Pero ayer, en un solo día, para ayudarme a llegar a los 4 millones...
¿Una vez pensaste en trabajar?
Trabajo.
Pero en algo serio que ayude al país.
No, serio que ayuda al país.
So you might ask the question, how has this happened? How is it the case that dialects separated by thousands of miles can be more similar to ones that are found only a couple dozen miles apart? Well, that was the other fascinating thing about the book to me. It chronicles the efforts that linguists have made to account for these different changes, from indigenous populations that were there before the Spanish colonized, to the African populations that were brought in as slaves and the way that might have affected the language. But the biggest impact seems to come from the fact that colonists who came from the southern Spain or Andalusia and the Canary Islands tended to be those who worked in ports or who worked in shipping. So when those same colonists came to the New World, they were more likely to settle in areas where they can continue that same trade, so near the ports and near the coasts. And when they settled in those areas, they brought with them their absolute disdain for pronouncing consonants. Meanwhile, governors, high officials, clergy, military leaders, other general fancy people tended to come more from the north of Spain, and they would likely settle in the capitals, so inland in the mountainous regions. This, of course, is a simplified version of things because there were tons of different Spanish languages that were brought over, and the unique mix of colonists in each region contributed to the way that language developed in that particular area. Double, meanwhile, in the River Plate region, while there was also lots of colonial settlement from southern Spain and from the Canary Islands, as any Argentinian can tell you, there was also tons and tons of immigration from Italy as well as other parts of Europe. And these boatloads of Italians that came over the course of several centuries had a deep impact on shaping the way that the local pronunciation, intonation, and even culture developed. And of course, this is probably a good time to remind you that language is constantly evolving. And so while the original colonists had an effect on the starting point of these dialects, they also continued having their own innovations, new pronunciations, new grammatical developments that happened right there in the colonies. Finally, the main section of the book actually does go back to a country-by-country division, tracing the linguistic history of each country, and in particular detailing the indigenous and African influence that could have shaped the pronunciation, grammatical features, and even special vocabulary in each area. So, does this mean that I'm telling everybody to go run out and get this book? Well, no. For one, nobody's paying me, so I'm not going to show for a book if I'm not getting paid for it. But, I mean, if you did find all this super interesting, it may be right up your alley. However, honestly, a lot of this information you can find by doing some digging on Wikipedia. But really, my main takeaway is just how interesting it can be if you're interested in a language to take a step back and look at the big picture. And when you're looking at the big picture, you can see the intricate, confusing, fascinating ways that language is connected. Side note, I literally lost a copy of my book while I was preparing this, so I had to use an online copy that I found, which I'll provide in the links, as well as any other resources that I found helpful in making this video. Wherever you're at in your Spanish learning journey, I hope you enjoy it, and I hope this video was at the very least interesting, if not helpful. And if you happen to be a native speaker, I really would love to hear your comments about how these categorizations seem to you, and maybe other ways that you see connections. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.
Decirte que en Guayaquil las personas son súper rápidas y cálidas con tu problemática.